West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire.
We're just moments away, and we'll take you there live. The White House briefing to detail the Biden administration's ambitious climate agenda. The change here is just monumental. From a president who called climate change a hoax to one who says the climate crisis will now be a major part of every administration decision, from transportation policy to military planning to American diplomacy around the world. Let's take a look at just some of the big changes we know are coming. Number one, it's just Trump versus Biden. It's an about-face. In 2017, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. President Biden has already said the United States is rejoining. In 2019, President Trump granted the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada through the United States. President Biden has already signed paperwork saying, no, sorry, we're stopping that project. Some new Biden initiatives, and they'll be discussed at the briefing today. This one is ambitious. In the next decade, the Biden administration says it wants to get to 30% conservation of U.S. land and water, much more conservation efforts across the country. One of the actions today will be stopping any new oil and gas leases on federal lands. Already objections from the oil industry about that. This is the big change. The administration says whether it's the Transportation Department, the Pentagon, U.S. diplomats overseas, climate change will be elevated into every conversation. The climate crisis must be a factor, the administration says, in any conversation about purchasing, diplomacy abroad, military installations. That's a huge shift there. This is another case where the American people, frankly, are way out ahead of their government. 72% of Americans in this Yale research say global warming is happening. 72% say it's happening, and 60% of American adults say they'd like their president to do more about this crisis. Let's have a conversation before the briefing with Catherine Hayhoe. She's director of the Climate Center at Texas Tech University. CNN's Phil Mattingly is still with us as well. Catherine, I want to start with you. We're going to get these specific changes today. But as a climate scientist, as someone who has tried to move the country and move citizens on this issue, how much of a difference does it make just the fact that from the president on down, you now have an administration that says this is a crisis, not a hoax?
I think it's absolutely critical. Make no mistake, the last 4 years, there have been cities like Houston and Chicago and Washington, D.C. There have been states, there have been companies like Microsoft. There have been nonprofits and tribal nations and universities who have all been taking action. But to finally have the federal government as a full partner will be a much needed shot of energy.
And Phil, to this point, again, there's so much change happening in these early days, you get dizzy. You're just at the White House now from a stint on Capitol Hill, back at the White House. The president's doing some things today through executive action. If he wants more, he's going to need cooperation in the Congress. What's the likelihood there?
Limited because of the current majority in the United States Senate, which is 50-50 with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie, and one of those 50 is Joe Manchin, who also will soon be the chairman of the key energy committee that oversees it. Obviously, he's protective of his home state. He's protective of his constituents, and I think that underscores the importance for this administration on actions like what they're doing today. Obviously, it's sweeping. Obviously, it brings to the forefront this issue, as you noted, across the agencies, and why that matters is the federal government's a little bit of an aircraft carrier. here, and to get it turned around, particularly in such a sharp, divergent way from the last administration, putting the emphasis on it across the agency, across all departments, matters and is important. Raising it as a national security issue matters and is important, as the Pentagon has done since 2014. But there's also the reality of the politics here, and that is they don't have the votes, regardless of whether they're breaking the filibuster or whether they think they can break the filibuster. They don't have the votes on Capitol Hill to move sweeping climate action at this point in time. So what the president is doing with the swipe of the pen matters, because it might be as much as he can do, at least in the broad scope of things.
And to that point then, Catherine, what do you see as most significant in the context of, you mentioned some of the local actions happening at the state and local level, the corporate level. Obviously, other players around the world have been moving. But for 4 years, the federal government of the United States essentially hit the pause and the halt button, and many people would say even reversed some modest progress that had been made in this. So when you have the president today talking about no new oil or gas leases on federal lands, action to protect 30% of federal lands and waters by 2030, elevating the climate crisis, essentially making clear it must be part of any conversation across the government right there, reestablishing a presidential council on advisors, memorandum on scientific integrity, the date for a big climate leaders summit, a global summit on the issue. Is there any one thing here, or is it all of the pieces at once that from a science perspective are necessary?
It's that whole set of actions that really matters, because we have to prepare for the impacts that we can no longer avoid that will affect every single one of us, whether Democrat, Republican, Independent, or anywhere in the political spectrum. We need to increase our efficiency. Through efficiency alone, we could cut carbon emissions in the U.S. by up to 50%, it's estimated. And we need to accelerate the transition to clean energy, not only because it's clean, but because it supplies real jobs for real people. There's already more jobs in the clean energy industry than in the oil and gas industry. And just comparing the pipeline, for example, with one of Biden's plans to clean up all of the damaged public lands because of oil and gas. It's estimated the cleanup could create well over 250,000 jobs, whereas the pipeline could create 11,000 temporary jobs, 35 permanent jobs, and some of those 35 jobs would be in Canada.
Catherine, right there, Phil, is touching on one of the conversations we already see happening, the oil and gas industry, both in the Keystone Pipeline decision, now in the decision to halt any new leases for oil or gas on land, saying the Biden administration is anti-jobs. The Biden administration is throwing Americans out of work. Catherine is saying there's a flip side, and there actually could be more jobs in this approach. But in terms of the politics of this here in D.C., the midterm elections coming up, that's one of the reasons I think you're saying that action in Congress is hard to come by.
Look, this has always been the issue with climate, right? Whether it's green jobs, whether it's how do you shift the paradigm to where you can not just talk about how the jobs market will increase if you take these actions, but actually show proof of it happening. And I think this is always kind of the balance that you're trying to strike. You saw the Obama administration try and strike it multiple times. You saw the Trump administration repeatedly talk about how the Paris Climate Accord was just going to wreck American jobs. How do you take that talking point away going into a political season? And again, if you read through what the Biden administration is doing today, they are putting the focus on attempting to kind of move into a new direction and actually create jobs in this marketplace. The other thing they're doing, which I think is very important, is, at least from their perspective, is the equity issue. Laura Barone-Lopez mentioned it last block about COVID. They're doing it again. 40% of the federal funds related to this are going to disadvantaged communities. That matters as well. But if you're talking about a very slim House majority, and you've got members in Pennsylvania, or you've got members in Texas, or you've got members like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, it is a very, very difficult issue on Capitol Hill to be able to push forward in a sweeping manner to the degree like those like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Sunrise Movement, those folks want them to push in the weeks and months ahead.
And so, Catherine Hayhoe, as you listen to the conversation here in Washington, one of the reasons I love your work is you're out in America, out in conservative America, in Texas. You're a climate evangelist, as you say. Your husband is a pastor in a Christian church, and you talk often about the misinformation that many conservative Christians have been getting, including those who supported, say, President Trump, who listened to hoax for 4 years. How do you think having a new administration that now puts this as a top priority in every conversation across government, again, whether it's procurement at the Department of Transportation, to Pentagon decisions, to American diplomats around the world, how does that change the conversation out there in America where there are skeptics, critics, and opponents of what the new president wants to do?
Well, 7% of people across the country are what the Yale program on climate communication calls dismissive. And they will continue to dismiss each and every effort by anyone to motivate climate action. But as you yourself said, 72% of people already say this is real. but only 40% think it affects them, and less than 35% of people across the whole country ever even have a conversation about it. And here's the connection. If we don't ever talk about it, why would we understand why it matters to us here and now? Not just the polar bears and our great-grandchildren, but here today. And if we don't understand why it matters, why would we ever do anything to fix it? So I think there's going to be a lot more positive discussion about constructive, creative, practical solutions today than there would have been 4 years ago. And I think that that's going to help move a lot of people in the middle who say, okay, it might be real, but what are we supposed to do about it that makes sense?
It is Tuesday, the 28th of December of 2021, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef, and our daily special is Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays on a snowy day here in Southern Oregon. We have the perfect repast. Yes, we do. And I should note that there is always roasted corn in the chowder here at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. How's your Tuesday going so far? Well, it's just starting out here on the West Coast. Well, you know, it's all relative, but you know what I mean. So, what local news should I fill you in on? Well, of course, we all know about Jared from Oregon. Had a little bit of tete-a-tete yesterday on the one of the local television stations. They have, of course, you know, their web presence, and they have their web page. And when they do their articles, they have a comment section that sometimes they don't turn off. I wonder who monitors it. But for the most part, liberal folks are just starting to comment now. They've been, I think, pretty much hiding for safety reasons, because you never know what might happen around here when the night riders are riding in the night. So I read this article about Jared, and I commented in the comments section about it. And, of course, you know, there's a lot of people out there who think that Trump won, and they're not going to let you forget it. So it was quite hilarious to a certain degree, but then, I started getting spammed. I even had some people spamming the West Coast Cookbook and West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Facebook page, which hardly anyone ever goes to. I mean, they go to Netroots Radio, but hardly anyone goes to the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy page. But then I had a bunch of them coming there and calling me a commie, a Satan worshiper. It's just, I got to tell you, it is dangerous talk that they embark on, while trying to convince me that Jared saying, "Let's go, Brandon," is like someone saying, "Oh, fudge." No, it's not. It's all about intent, isn't it? I mean, even a kid will be reprimanded by their parent, which makes me wonder about some of the parents these days. Okay? I'm just saying. You know, if you got a kid that's going out there shooting up a school because you gave him a gun for Christmas, and then he takes it out before Christmas and kills people with it, I think there's a parenting problem there. Or lack thereof. Now, I remember distinctly when I was a child that if I went around and said, "Fudge you," I would have had my little tushy tapped a few times with an open hand, mind you. Because I could not get away with saying, "Well, I just said fudge. I meant fudge." And my mom would say, "No, you meant something else." I mean, it was even in our household. If you pointed your finger at someone and went bang, that was a punishable offense too. You would be put in your room and made to stay there alone until you found the error of your ways. Or as my mom would put it, "You are pretending to kill people?" You know, like that's a bad thing, right? Shouldn't it be? Yes, it should. So here I have a bunch of children, apparently, some well into their 50s and 60s, who think that they can get away with the old dodge of, Jared just said fudge. He's the equivalent of fudge. He said the equivalent of F you. And even that's like not even completely what he said, because I'm trying to keep it clean. It's still early in the morning here on the West Coast of America. So Jared meant exactly what he meant. And some on the television comment page said, well, he probably didn't even mean to be on the call. He made the call. He had his YouTube going while he made the call. He recorded it on YouTube while it was happening. And then within an hour, he was being interviewed on right-wing websites or right-wing news sites. So please. And then he goes on Bannon's show and goes full MAGA. Wearing the red hat. America, great again. Yeah, Nazi. And made it very clear that Trump won and Joe Biden stole the election. And that is why they are Nazis. The big lie. It's like a branding thing. I hate the idea that the big lie is some sort of branded name. It diminishes exactly what it is. So I did get to block a bunch of people, which I hardly ever do, but I'm doing it now. And they just actually it felt pretty good. In some instances, if you can block them first, then you win. With issues like with Glenn Greenwald, those types, if they block you first, then you win. But I still don't get the idea that someone who purports themselves to be a Christian would drop F-bombs to the President of the United States on Christmas Eve. Is that how they celebrate Christmas Eve at the Schmeck House? Oh, another point, too. He also said that he always calls the Santa hotline on Christmas. So, there again, he meant to call the President of the United States and say, let's go, Brandon. F you, Schmeck. It's crass. It's being a bully. It's pushing your weight around. And that is not the way that you live in a community. I refuse to let the bullies win and then call us Satan worshipers because we want to get along. BS. They're antisocial. Maybe in their little bars and stuff that they used to go to the pandemic, they were, big man at the bar. Well, there's more going on in the world than that. When you have children put in icebox baby gulags, and we're going to memory hole that. Okay. I guess I've ranted enough. I have more to rant on, but I think that we will get to the curated part of the show. Because as you know, we all need to center ourselves in times of woe. On the rest of the menu here, well, actually starting off at the top, Joe Biden issued a flurry of climate-related executive actions. Just don't look up. On the rest of the menu, some of America's most spectacular natural settings and historical icons are getting a makeover, and it's about time. I think that we should have a citizen conservation corps all the time. And we can take care of the national parks and, I don't know, maybe start repairing some bridges. Wouldn't that be nice? The increased scrutiny on racial reckoning has prompted a review of historical markers. And Thomas E. Lovejoy, a leading conservation biologist who is credited with popularizing the term biological diversity, has died at age 80. After the break, we move to the chef's table, where a BBC investigative journalist has left Russia for exile in Britain. Well, that's almost expected now, isn't it? And a court in military-ruled Myanmar postponed its verdicts on 2 charges against ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi, in which she is accused of the terrible crime of importing and possessing walkie-talkies. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. At netrootsradio.com, to the right of the page is the chat room, and the chat room is monitored by Kelly Lincoln. Thank you, Kelly. To the left of that chat room link, across the page near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com, is the link to our Patreon page. And if you could become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio, it would help so much. If you could afford an espresso type coffee drink, and if you could afford to send those funds our way once a month, yes, it will help. It helps us pay our bills so we can fly under the radar and continue this powerhouse of resistance against the hostile takeover of the United States of America. But it also helps us upgrade the hardware and software that continuously needs upgrading. Damn planned obsolescence. It's going to be another rant of mine for, half a show, is how we fell back into that. But, it's been with us ever since the information age. Anyway, if you could afford to send those funds to us once a month, we will be able to pay our bills, do the needed upgrades that are always needed, and continue against this hostile takeover. And we thank you for your generosity, and we thank you for considering being so generous in the future. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, do so at Netroots Radio. Thank you, Tom, for taking care of that. Follow me on Twitter at Justice Putnam. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Codes about 10 minutes before showtime. Get that linked up on Twitter and other social media platforms. And of course, the show notes and links are where you find the real reportage, because there is real reportage behind all of this. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Cookbook West, and please do pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, iTunes, etc., etc., etc. All right, this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, as we start off, is out of the Associated Press by way of the American Independent. Near the tidal basin in Washington, crews have cleaned grime off the white marble exterior of the Jefferson Memorial and fixed cracked stone to prevent falling debris. At the Statue of Liberty, plans are in the works to waterproof the exterior of the massive stone fort built in 1807 that serves as the monument's base. And at New River Gorge in West Virginia, one of the newest national parks, historical masonry grills have been restored near the Grand View Visitor Center, which features a breathtaking overlook of the valley and waterway 1,400 feet below. Under legislation passed by Congress in 2020, some of America's most spectacular natural settings and historical icons, from the monuments of the East Coast to the Grand Canyon and Yosemite in the West, are getting a makeover. The Great American Outdoor Act, dedicates up to $1.6 billion a year for the next 5 years for extensive maintenance and repairs that have been put off time and time again. The funding will go toward critical projects in national parks, forests, wildlife refuges, and recreation areas, according to the Department of Interior. It also includes funding for tribal schools. I expect the Bundy crew to be opposed to all of this. And they got the guns, and they'll probably show up, too. Some of the first projects being funded are smaller ones that will preserve historical structures like the grills at New River Gorge and the marble walls of the Jefferson Memorial. But dozens of other projects are coming, some more urgent than others. In Puerto Rico, plans call for stabilizing a cliffside eroded by wind, rain, and waves at San Juan National Historic Site to stop rocks from falling on a popular recreation trail below. It'd be nice if they could get electricity to the island, wouldn't it? It would. Another project will repair the failing left abutment of the 146-year-old Masonry Dam on the Potomac River at Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Historical Park to prevent possible loss of life from a sudden release of water. A dam break. At the Grand Canyon, a massive Swiss chalet-style building with oversized balconies, windows, and eaves is in line for an upgrade that will bring the now vacant structure up to code and stabilize it while the park determines how best to use it. When I went to Cal Poly Pomona, I was in the restaurant management, hotel restaurant management program there. And though my major was liberal studies, I got into the program because, hey, there's always a job in food services. But we did internships at the resort at the Grand Canyon, the part of the Kellogg Foundation. Yeah, that Kellogg. Isn't that great? Yeah. And I remember that Swiss chalet. Interesting. Vacant and falling apart. Well, good. It needs to be fixed. Some of the projects planned for the next year will fix problems with infrastructure that park visitors might not immediately notice. Repaving roads, repairing leaky lodge roofs, and replacing outdated utilities that pose safety risks. The Great American Outdoors Act overall, with the amount of funding available, offers us really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to take care of some of the large projects, the large needs of the National Park Service, while also addressing several critical smaller projects, said Mike Caldwell, National Park Service Associate Director of Park Planning, Facilities, and Lands. Mark Scofaro of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, Tarrytown Chowder, Tuesdays. Pennsylvania has been installing historical markers for more than a century when the racist violence of Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017 brought a fresh round of questions from the public about just whose stories were being told on the state's roadsides and the language used to tell them. The increased scrutiny helped prompt a review of all 2,500 markers by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, a process that has focused on factual errors, inadequate historical context, and racist or otherwise inappropriate references. So far, the state has removed 2 markers, revised 2, and ordered the new text for 2 others. Across the country, historical markers have in some places become another front in the national reckoning over slavery, segregation, and racial violence that has also brought down Civil War statues and changed or reconsidered the names of institutions, roads, and geographical features. The idea that who is honored, what is remembered, what is memorialized tells a story about a society that can't be reflected in other ways is behind an effort by the Montgomery, Alabama-based Equal Justice Initiative that has installed dozens of markers, mostly in the South, to remember racial terror lynchings. Historical markers educate the public and therefore can help fight systemic racism, said Diane Turner, curator of the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection at Temple University in Philadelphia, one of the country's largest repositories of Black history and literature and related material. By being able to tell everybody's story, it's good for the society as a whole. It's not to take away from anybody else, Turner said. Let's have these stories, because the more truth we have, the better it is. At the request of Bryn Mawr's college president, Kimberly Wright Cassidy, the Pennsylvania History Agency removed a marker from the edge of campus that noted President Woodrow Wilson had briefly taught there. Cassidy's letter to the commission cited Wilson's dismissive comments about the intellectual capabilities of women and his racist policy of federal workforce segregation. Yeah. And, his wife ran the government for quite a while he was, shall we say, incapacitated. The commission has ordered changes to a marker at the suburban Philadelphia birthplace of Continental Army Major General Mad Anthony Wayne, because it referred to him as an Indian fighter. It also is developing a replacement to a marker that has been removed from the grounds of the National Aviary in Pittsburgh on the site of a 19th century prison that noted Confederate cavalry were held there after their capture in Ohio during the Civil War. The changes have generated some political pushback, including from, guess who? A Republican state representative, an appointee of the Historical and Museum Commission who wrote in October about his objections to the initiative. My fear is that the commission is becoming less of a true historical arbiter and more of a miniaturized version of George Orwell's Ministry of Truth, that is, government officers alter history to fit the convenient narrative of those in charge. State Representative Park Wentling wrote in a sniveling scrawl in this reporter's opinion. In a report to the commission, a contractor recounted that an elected Fulton County commissioner harassed his team when they removed the old markers last year. And this month, a senior state House Republican press aide, Steve Miskin, responded to a news account about the Fulton County markers with a tweet asking, "Is Pennsylvania planning to remove the Confederacy from textbooks, censor TV shows and movies mentioning the Confederacy? No, you idiot. We're going to stop celebrating it." Associated Press staff brings us this final offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook, a Speakeasy. Thomas E. Lovejoy, a leading conservation biologist who is credited credited with popularizing the term biological diversity, has died. He was 80. His death on Saturday was announced by George Mason University, where he was director of the Institute for a Sustainable Earth and the Amazon Biodiversity Center, which he founded. Lovejoy began referring to biological diversity, the rich variety of life on Earth, in the late 1970s, later shortened to biodiversity. It has become one of the most important themes in the age of climate change. A leading extinction researcher, Lovejoy found that habitat destruction, pollution, and global warming were snuffing out species around the world. He called for restoring forests to encourage the regrowth of native plants and animals and for protecting large tracts of water and land. Lovejoy also was involved in the founding of U.S. Public Television's Nature, the venerable show featuring stunning video from ecosystems around the world. At the time of the show's inception in 1982, he was working for the World Wildlife Fund. Well, let's get to our break, and when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world, and we will finish up with the stories that we've curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, and we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Emily Schwing. A willless and speechless human believed to have died and been supernaturally reanimated. A person markedly strange in appearance or behavior. A mixed drink made of several kinds of rum, liqueur, and fruit juice. According to Merriam-Webster, these are all ways to describe a zombie. But maybe that definition should also include mention of wildfires, the kind that smolder and creep along underground in the boreal forests of the far north and subarctic.
You know, we think they're out and, there's snow and it's cold all winter. And then in the spring, when they start smoking up again, it's like they're back from the dead.
This past spring, Randy Jant and her colleagues published a paper in Nature about wildfires that overwinter in the boreal forest. Jant is a former wildland firefighter. She's also a fire ecologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Fire Science Consortium.
If you would have asked me about that in the 90s or in the 80s when I started working in Alaska and in the fire community, I would have said, gosh, that is just a really rare thing.
Jant can recall one memorable zombie fire which reignited after overwintering in May 1996. It stands out not only because of how much work it took to put out, but also because in 1996, this kind of fire, one that overwinters, was very rare. But according to the study in Nature, zombie fires are becoming a more frequent phenomenon.
These can be stubborn, deep-burning fires that require pumps and hoses and, a lot of effort to put out. One of our colleagues who had a full career smoke jumping in Alaska, 46 years as a wildland firefighter, saw that article in Nature and related that it was an overwinter fire near Eagle, Alaska. That was the most work per acre of any fire he was ever on in that 46 years. I thought that was pretty remarkable.
Well, I'm Rod Dow, and I smoke jumped for a long time. I fought fire for 45 or 46 or 47 years, depending on what you count. And all of that was on the fire line.
Rod Dow is now retired, but he has hours of stories to share from his lengthy career as a wildland firefighter and smoke jumper. He says he has vivid memories of that 1996 fire out on the Alaska-Canada border.
I find it really remarkable that I can call you and say, hey, Rod, tell me about the Damien fire, and you remember all these details.
Yeah, Yeah, it's pretty. That one, it was the work.
The work.
There was nothing enjoyable about any of it. It was just constant 14 days of 14 hours a day, and I've never seen a fire that was that amount of labor per acre. It was just really amazing.
The Damien Fire was estimated at 6.66 acres. It was named the Damien Fire after the 1978 thriller The Omen, about a man who replaces his stillborn son with a living one, only to find he may have adopted a relentlessly murderous antichrist.
It's mother, Mr. Thorne.
It's on my wife.
It's mother.
What is it you're trying to say?
His mother was a...
This is not a human child.
The fire smoldered underground in the winter of 1995 and burned into 1996 under stands of trees that toppled over on one another like pickup sticks. Firefighters call this dog hair, and they have to cut through it all with chainsaws to attack the blaze.
If you could picture 4 football fields continuously strewn with logs at chest-deep level, a gap in between the logs would be about big enough to stand in, maybe. It was nearly continuous logs crisscrossed on top of each other. And then underneath all of that was this foot-deep boiling ash.
Much like Damien in The Omen, overwintering fires just don't seem to give up.
I mean, that is an enormous amount of chainsawing, and that doesn't even count the, putting the heat out.
For 2 weeks, Dow and a team of firefighters went after the smoldering forest floor. He says 8 chainsaws were running at once alongside a high-pressure fire hose connected to a pump.
And that water is turning to steam at an enormous rate because there's hundreds of gallons of water coming out the end of the hose, and it's all turning to steam at once. And so it's blasting these giant steam clouds, and because it's exploding out of the ground, it's carrying all this ash up into the air around you.
Since 2005, scientists have noted at least 40 overwintering wildfires in the Alaskan and Canadian far north. The Arctic is warming at least 3 times faster than other parts of the world. That means the snowpack in places like Alaska is melting earlier in the year. According to the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, more than 2.5 times as much acreage burned in the northernmost state between 2001 and 2020 in comparison to the 1990s. These zombie fires are still rare, accounting for just under 1% of all land burned annually in Alaska and Canada. But there have been single years where the area burned by these underground infernos has been described as exceptional, totaling up to about 38% in the region.
Well, really, the reason that they are starting to overwinter somewhat more frequently, it goes along with these warmer summers and the opportunity for us to get deeper drying into those deep organic moss layers that underlie the forest and the tundra. And that's the key. So if the fire can get deeply embedded into those organic, peaty kind of duff materials, they can just hide out.
The Boreal Forest, also known as taiga, is the largest terrestrial biome on the planet. And thanks to climate warming, this ecosystem is becoming increasingly vulnerable to wildfire. That's significant because estimates show at least 1/3 of the world's terrestrial carbon is stored in these forests, in the trees, in the soil, in the understory plants. And when it all burns, this carbon is released to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, a potent greenhouse gas. Jant says the increasing prevalence of zombie fires could challenge fire and land managers, who are already struggling to find ways to bolster thin budgets.
So the time of year they might begin to pop up in early spring is often really early, where fire crews are still being hired, trained, and there's not many aircraft on contract yet. And, and firefighters are aware that a fire, if it's been smoldering all winter, it may have burned very deep into the ground, and it could be hard to dig it out and extinguish it.
In the last 2 fire seasons, other parts of the world dominated by Boreal Forest have also seen overwintering fires. And Jant says that may be where some of her research goes next.
So when we start looking at Siberia and Eurasia, that's going to be really interesting because there was these overwintering fires seem to have been a really important contributor to that really awesome fire season, awesome in a bad way, that Siberia had in 2020. Did you hear about that? They burned 35 million acres. I mean, can you wrap your head around that? Oregon thought they had a bad season in 2020. It was less than 1 million acres burned. So, 35 million is amazing.
Fires that overwintered started popping up again last spring, contributing to another intense fire season in Siberia this past year. Jant says there's no doubt much of this change in the fire environment is due to a changing climate. From a science perspective, she says it's an exciting time to be a fire ecologist.
It's just because it's so astounding to be able to measure it over your career, one person's career.
She says the way these fires are burning has a transformative effect on everything, from the topography to the plants that return once the fire's finally out. What if that fire is never entirely extinguished? Could zombie fires turn more vampiric, like Dracula draining the life from forests to sustain the flames forever? It's unlikely if firefighters like Rod Dow keep their chainsaws sharpened, their certifications current, and there's funding in the budget to go around. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Emily Schwing.
Hi, it's Tom. Could we humbly suggest your donation to netrootsradio.com? All we've got to run this 24-hour powerhouse of progressive resistance radio is what comes out of our own wallets. And you are our biggest donor. And it doesn't take much, $3, $5. Just go to the bottom of our netrootsradio.com page and hit our secure donate button. Heck, you can even make a recurring contribution. So donate what you'd like at the bottom of our netrootsradio.com's homepage, because you are our biggest donor. netrootsradio.com. Together, we are Resistance Radio.
Welcome to 60-Second Civics, the daily podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is an important American founding document. The Connecticut colony has its origins in 1636, when Thomas Hooker led a group of dissenting Puritans from Massachusetts to the Connecticut Valley. 3 years later, these settlers adopted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. During his sermon in 1638, Hooker made a radical statement. The foundation of authority is laid firstly in the free consent of people. The Fundamental Orders was unusual in that it derived its authority not from the king, but from the free men of the colony. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was, in effect, a written constitution, and established the precedent for the American preference for written constitutions rather than the partially unwritten Constitution of Britain. The Fundamental Orders established a legislative assembly, a governor, and a court system. The federal Constitution, which was ratified in 1788, would later establish a system with legislative, executive, and judicial branches. That's all for today's podcast, 60-Second Civics, where civic education only takes a minute.
At the Supreme Court, what's the shadow docket? I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. Mention the Supreme Court, and you probably envision a deliberative, thoughtful process that begins with the list of cases that the justices will decide that term. It's docket. Cases thoroughly litigated, for example, after a federal district court trial and lengthy review by a court of appeals, followed by extensive briefing and oral argument at the high court itself, and then an opinion with all votes and reasoning publicly disclosed. It's a process designed to appear thoughtful and transparent. In a word, judicial. But now, with increasing frequency, the court is plucking cases for decision from its shadow docket, which operates differently from what we've just described. Although a mechanism for dealing with emergencies has existed since the court's inception, this court's shadow docket is different. Cases on the shadow docket have not had the same deliberative process, and the shadow docket is being used more frequently and consequentially for decisions on, for example, the death penalty, abortion, immigration, and COVID-19 safety restrictions. The shadow docket cases can be a rush to judgment that ends in a decision a sentence or two long with no name of any justice attached. The Supreme Court's extensive use of the shadow docket is problematic because it undermines the public's faith in the court at a time in its and the country's history when the court needs to be seen as operating in the sunshine and not in the shadows. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1973. That was the day 3 astronauts aboard Skylab 4 staged a one-day strike against NASA while in outer space. It was an 84-day mission consisting of grueling 16-hour workdays. The crew was tasked with spacewalk inspections of the spaceship, comet observations, medical experiments, and many projects to photograph the Earth. Soon, Mission Commander Jerry Carr, science pilot Ed Gibson, and pilot William Pogue found themselves behind schedule, exhausted, and in Pogue's case, sick. NASA insisted they work through meal and rest breaks in order to catch up. They became increasingly frustrated by endless instructions that micromanaged every move. Infuriated by Mission Control's eavesdropping on their conversations, Gibson argued the mission felt like a 33-day fire drill. Carr stated, quote, "We would never work 16 hours a day for 84 straight days on the ground, and we should not be expected to do it here in space." When Mission Control dismissed the 3 as complainers, the crew demanded a return to rest and meal breaks and an end to their relentless schedule. Their demands were ignored, and so they simply turned off the radio link with the ground crew. Relations improved when the crew reestablished communications the next day. Their schedules were adjusted and breaks restored, though none ever went into space again. Debates continue whether this episode is instructive for the labor movement. Samir Chopra notes, "For those convinced of the value of their work are likely to push back when placed in an artificially controlled, too tightly regulated environment. The lessons here are not just for manned space flights, but for any workplace environment that approximates its conditions." Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River and the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 30 degrees Fahrenheit, expecting only a high of 34. Cloudy conditions currently with a bit of snow falling, and we'll have even more snow falling in the afternoon. Temps nearly steady in the mid to low 30s, winds light and variable. Expecting snow to pile up around an inch to an inch and a half. Snow likely tonight with lows in the low 30s, winds light and variable. Snow should accumulate around an inch, and then mostly cloudy with snow showers during the morning and very cold. And winds will be light and variable, and snow should pile up about 2 inches or so. Confirmed cases of coronavirus in Jackson County in the southern part of Oregon continue to rise, We now stand at 262,014 confirmed cases with 387 confirmed deceased. Pollen is rated as none right outside the window here in Rogue River proper. The air quality index for the region is good at 29 parts per million, and the daytime UV index is low at level 2. Barometric pressure is rising at 29.84 inches. Visibility is down to 4 miles, and relative humidity is at 98%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. London is 52 and mostly cloudy. Paris is 53 and partly cloudy. Rome is 58 and mostly cloudy. Kyiv is 20 degrees and cloudy. Kabul is 29 and clear. Hong Kong is 58 and mostly cloudy. Tokyo is 37 degrees and partly cloudy. Sydney, Australia is 60 and mostly cloudy. San Francisco, California is 42 degrees and cloudy. And New York is a crisp 42 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Reuters brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Tarrytown Chowder Tuesdays. An investigative journalist from BBC's Russian language service in Moscow said that he had felt compelled to leave Russia for what he called exile in Britain due to what he said was unprecedented surveillance. Russian authorities designated Andrei Sakharov a foreign agent in October, a decision the British broadcaster said at the time it strongly rejected and would try to overturn. The designation was the latest twist in a crackdown on media outlets that the authorities in Moscow see as hostile and foreign-backed. Separately, BBC journalist Sarah Rainsford left Russia in August after Moscow refused to extend her permission to work in what it said was a tit-for-tat row with Britain over the treatment of foreign media. The foreign agent designation has Cold War-era connotations and requires those so labeled to prominently indicate in all their content that they are foreign agents, something which can hurt advertising revenue. Zakharov said in a BBC Russian report he authored about other journalists designated as foreign agents that he felt compelled to leave Russia after noticing what he called unprecedented surveillance of his activities in Moscow. He did not say in the report, which was posted on the broadcaster's Russian YouTube page, who was watching him, and added he wasn't sure if he was being followed because of his foreign agent designation or because of a recent investigation he had carried out into alleged Russian hackers.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Cassidy Benchpongsa of the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. A court in military-ruled Myanmar postponed its verdicts on 2 charges against ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi, in which she is accused of importing and possessing walkie-talkies without following official procedures. A legal official familiar with the case said. The case in the court in the capital is among many brought against the 76-year-old Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Since the army seized power in February, the court gave no reason for delaying the verdicts until January 10th. Suu Kyi's party had won in a landslide victory in last year's general election, but the military said there was widespread electoral fraud, an assertion that independent poll watchers doubt. Oh, she could get 100 years in prison on the charges for having walkie-talkies. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up tomorrow for Smothered Benedict Wednesdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we'll meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte coeur. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme au long de golfe clair, t'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver.